Not even the soldiers on the ground who had rehearsed, drilled, and mentally prepared for what they believed this fight would look like. Within the span of just a few hours, a conflict that the world had been reassured was contained, manageable, and firmly under control, suddenly revealed an entirely different reality beneath its surface. A reality that was more dangerous, more organized, and considerably more deadly than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The figures emerging from that battlefield were not the kind you process and move on from. But before those numbers can mean anything, there is something you absolutely must understand first. Because this is not simply another exchange of fire along a disputed boundary. This is not just missiles and warplanes and carefully worded press releases. What took place in Lebanon was the product of years of meticulous groundwork, decades of deliberate strategy, and a degree of military sophistication that has left some of the most seasoned observers in the world genuinely stunned. To grasp how this moment arrived, you have to travel back not a few months, but many years. Hezbollah did not construct its military machine overnight. It did not accumulate weapons impulsively or recruit fighters without purpose. Everything that materialized in Lebanon was the result of a calculated, patient, and extraordinarily well-resourced long-term blueprint. Iran, the principal sponsor behind Hezbollah, poured billions of dollars across multiple decades into transforming what had once been a militia into something that now bears a genuine resemblance to a professional standing army. Weapons were imported, tunnel networks were excavated, engineers were trained, tacticians were cultivated, drone operators, anti-tank specialists, and precision missile crews were developed with a kind of institutional commitment that most armed groups could never sustain. But here is the piece most people never hear. Hezbollah's strategic planners conducted a thorough, exhaustive postmortem on every single Israeli military operation going back to the 2006 war. They examined their own failures during that conflict with brutal honesty. They studied Israeli tactics, Israeli technology, Israeli response windows, and critically, Israeli vulnerabilities. And then they dedicated the following 18 years to constructing a fighting force built specifically to exploit those vulnerabilities. That is not conjecture. That is documented, traceable strategic planning. And when the guns resumed their conversation, the results on the ground reflected exactly that investment. When Israeli forces moved into southern Lebanon, the prevailing expectation in the early days was that Hezbollah would fight the way it had always fought before. Harassing strikes and rapid withdrawals, rocket barrages launched from safe distances, guerrilla pressure designed to erode the IDF gradually without ever committing to direct, sustained confrontation. A war of slow bleeding rather than decisive engagement. That is not what happened. What Israeli soldiers actually encountered inside southern Lebanon was something a significant portion of them had never faced at this scale before. Fortified defensive positions, underground command facilities, pre-positioned weapons caches placed with calculated precision, coordinated ambush corridors designed to funnel advancing forces into killing grounds, and a level of tactical communication and battlefield discipline that pointed clearly towards serious, professional military training. The terrain itself functioned as a weapon. Southern Lebanon is not open desert where air power can reach anything that moves. It is a landscape of ridgelines, valleys, thick vegetation, hilltop stone villages, and a sprawling underground infrastructure that Hezbollah had been building and expanding for over a decade. Forces moving through that terrain were not moving through spaces where technological superiority automatically translates into control. They were moving through environments where a small disciplined team equipped with the right weapons and intimate knowledge of the land could inflict damage far beyond what their numbers should allow. And they did. The casualty figures that began surfacing from that conflict were not merely statistics. They were evidence. Evidence that Hezbollah had achieved something it had never quite managed before in a direct confrontation with one of the most capable militaries in the region. It had demonstrated genuine, sustained lethality at scale. War is inherently chaotic. Casualty numbers in active conflict are almost universally contested, frequently inflated, and sometimes deliberately distorted by both parties for psychological effect. That is a universal feature of armed conflict, and it applies here as well. But when multiple independent sources, soldier testimonies, satellite imagery, and third-party intelligence assessments begin converging on a consistent picture, that picture demands serious engagement. The story it tells is deeply layered. When discussing Israeli military losses in Lebanon, the context matters enormously. This was a highly trained, exceptionally well-equipped force encountering an adversary that had specifically engineered itself for exactly this kind of confrontation. The IDF is not an ordinary military. Its soldiers undergo intensive training. Its equipment ranks among the most advanced on Earth. Its intelligence architecture is genuinely formidable. And yet, in certain engagements inside southern Lebanon, that force absorbed losses that strained the boundaries of what the official narrative was prepared to accommodate. The question serious analysts kept returning to was not simply how many, it was how. How was Hezbollah capable of inflicting meaningful casualties on a force possessing air dominance, armored vehicles, real-time battlefield surveillance, and years of direct operational experience in precisely this kind of warfare? The answer illuminates something significant about the trajectory of modern conflict itself. Anti-tank guided missiles represent one major part of the explanation. Hezbollah had accumulated a vast stockpile of anti-armor weaponry, including sophisticated Russian origin systems capable of defeating contemporary armor at considerable range. When Israeli armored units moved through narrow streets or along predictable approach corridors in southern Lebanese towns, waiting Hezbollah teams with anti-tank missiles found their targets with alarming consistency. But the missiles alone do not complete the picture. Drones, specifically the integration of commercially available and modified unmanned systems as both reconnaissance and weapons platforms, introduced a persistent overhead threat that significantly complicated Israeli maneuver. Drones could scout positions, verify targets, and in certain cases deliver munitions directly onto armored vehicles and infantry formations with a precision requiring no pilot overhead and no elaborate logistics chain on the ground. This was not the Hezbollah that fought in 2006. This was something fundamentally different. And then there were the tunnels. The underground network Hezbollah had constructed beneath southern Lebanon is, by any objective measure, a remarkable feat of sustained engineering. These were not rough excavations. They were reinforced subterranean corridors, some wide enough to accommodate vehicles, equipped with communications, infrastructure, ventilation systems, and weapon storage. They enabled fighters to move, resupply, evacuate casualties, and reposition without ever appearing on the surface where aerial surveillance could track them. For a military that depends heavily on air power and intelligence dominance, fighting an opponent that can literally vanish underground presents a category of problem that additional airstrikes cannot resolve. The counterattack phase is where the story reaches its most critical juncture. There is a specific moment in any conflict where the military situation shifts, not incrementally, but in ways that fundamentally alter the entire strategic picture. Military historians recognize these as inflection points. What occurred in Lebanon during Hezbollah's coordinated counter-operations represented exactly such a moment. Israeli forces had achieved meaningful advances in certain sectors. The stated objectives were clear: push Hezbollah back from the border, dismantle the infrastructure used to strike northern Israel, and demonstrate that sustained attacks on Israeli territory would carry a serious military price. Those objectives were genuine, and early operational phases did register certain tactical gains. But Hezbollah had specifically prepared for this scenario. The counterattack, when it arrived, was not improvised. It was not the panicked response of an organization being pushed against a wall. It was coordinated, pre-planned, and targeted at specific Israeli positions, with an accuracy that suggested Hezbollah possessed a far clearer operational picture of Israeli deployments than most observers had assumed. Multiple simultaneous engagements, coordinated fire from multiple axes, anti-armor teams pre-positioned along approach routes that Israeli forces would need to use, drone reconnaissance feeding real-time intelligence to ground commanders, an underground mobility network that allowed fighters to emerge, engage, and disappear before air power could respond effectively. What followed changed the calculations of everyone watching. When those engagements concluded and the battlefield picture became legible, the Israeli casualty figures were significant enough to generate serious internal debate within the military command and political leadership about the trajectory of the entire operation. Significant losses in this context does not mean the IDF was defeated. It does not mean Hezbollah prevailed in any conventional military sense, but it does mean the operation's cost exceeded what public statements had conveyed, and it means the narrative of a clean, controlled, technologically dominant campaign was not fully aligned with what was actually unfolding on the ground. That gap between official narrative and battlefield reality is where this story becomes genuinely consequential. Because in war, that gap never stays buried indefinitely. The civilian dimension of this conflict deserves equal weight. The Israeli air campaign had devastating consequences for Lebanese infrastructure in populated areas across the south and in the southern suburbs of Beirut. The strikes were sustained, and in many cases imprecise enough to produce civilian casualties that drew intense international scrutiny. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were uprooted from their homes. The Lebanese state, already hollowed out and financially destroyed, had zero capacity to manage the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding within its borders. That catastrophe became a strategic element in itself. Hezbollah has always understood that civilian suffering in Lebanon generates international pressure that eventually constrains Israeli military operations. It is a deeply cynical calculation. It has been fairly and extensively criticized, but it carries a historical track record that cannot be honestly dismissed. Meanwhile, the northern Israeli population was living its own crisis. Tens of thousands of Israelis had been evacuated from border communities. Families were dispersed into hotels and temporary arrangements, separated from homes, businesses, and ordinary life. For those people, the question was never geopolitical. It was personal. When do we go home? When can our children stop sleeping to the sound of sirens? That personal pressure was one of the primary forces driving the political decision to escalate the Lebanese operation. And therein lies the central strategic trap. The operation designed to restore safety to northern Israeli communities required fighting in terrain and against an opponent that made clean, decisive outcomes extraordinarily difficult to achieve. A limited operation would not deliver genuine security. An extended operation would produce casualties, attract international pressure, risk regional escalation, and potentially still fall short of the definitive result that the domestic political environment demanded. The international response added another layer of complexity. The United States found itself walking an increasingly narrow path, simultaneously reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself while expressing concern over civilian casualties, supplying military assistance while pursuing diplomatic channels to prevent wider escalation. European governments had moved more openly toward explicit ceasefire calls. The gap between Washington and its European partners was visibly widening. In Arab capitals, popular pressure was building in ways that even authoritarian governments could not entirely absorb. The information environment, shaped by the speed and reach of social media, ensured that images from Lebanon circulated globally with an intensity and velocity that no previous conflict had experienced. Three trajectories were visible to serious observers at this stage: continued escalation with mounting casualties and intensifying international pressure, but no decisive breakthrough. A negotiated halt, brokered through back channels involving American, Qatari, and European intermediaries, producing a ceasefire that satisfied nobody completely and allowed both sides to claim some version of victory. Or miscalculation. The trajectory no one wanted, but that history has repeatedly delivered. A strike that goes beyond its intended boundaries. A response that spirals past anyone's original design. A development elsewhere in the region that pulls additional actors in and transforms a contained conflict into something no one planned for, but everyone accidentally created. History in this region carries specific weight here. Military operations in Lebanon in 1982 and again in 2006 did not deliver the permanent security outcomes that were used to justify their costs. That pattern does not determine the present. Contexts evolve, capabilities change, political dynamics shift. But anyone claiming easy certainty about the outcome of military operations in Lebanon is not paying adequate attention to the record. Somewhere in southern Lebanon, a soldier was in a position they had not anticipated, not from lack of preparation or courage, but because the force they were fighting had spent years preparing for precisely that encounter. Somewhere in northern Israel, a family was still waiting to go home. Somewhere in southern Lebanon, a civilian family had lost a home, a relative, or both, not because they were combatants, but because war consistently fails to distinguish between those who make it and those who simply exist within its reach. Those human realities exist beneath every layer of strategy and analysis. They are what this conflict is genuinely made of. And they are why what happens in that corridor between the Mediterranean coast and the Lebanese highlands will ripple outward in ways that extend far beyond any single military operation. The true weight of this moment is not found in casualty figures or territorial maps. It lives in the question those figures force onto the table. Is there a version of this story that ends without